Everybody, welcome to another Screenwriting Tips. My name is Tony D. All right, today we're going to talk about writing a coming-of-age movie. So, why am I talking about this? Well, coming-of-age movies never really go out of style in Hollywood. That's because it's always got a young cast as your main protagonist, and that is definitely something movie people like. Young cast. You gotta have youth in your movie a lot of times. So, they never really go out of style. In the 80s, they were really big. I mean, now they're still in there. The problem with writing a coming-of-age movie now is so many have been done before that once... oh, hold on. Little Joan wants to say hi. Hello. Once Hollywood has, a movie like Clueless, and that's a coming-of-age movie, they could always remake it, recast it, and do it again. They don't need a screenwriter really. They'll just get some studio person to, update the screenplay a little bit. So, if you're going to write a coming-of-age movie and sell it, it has to be unique. But first, let's go over the elements of a coming-of-age movie. So obviously you have a young protagonist who is becoming an adult, and that is the crux of the plot. So without that, it's not a coming-of-age movie. So it's about teenagers going to adulthood. Possibly the highest you can go is maybe college, because you're still kind of almost a teenager, at least in the beginning if you're a freshman. But basically, any older than that, it starts to become more of a different kind of movie. So, coming of age, I mean, it is possible to have an older character who's very immature and then it has a coming of age moment later, but more often than not, the kind of movie that's going to sell, the kind of movie you're probably going to be writing is, a group of characters in high school that are about to graduate, or a group of characters that just got in college. In the United States, that's a very definitive line here. Definitive age, you're turning 18, you're becoming an adult. In other cultures, that may differ. And I said in the previous video, these kinds of movies are tough to sell overseas because the cultures are different. Although you're going to come of age in other countries around a similar time, their cultures, they don't have the same kind of high schools. They don't have the same kind of jobs or colleges. So watching a bunch of rich American kids go to college and deal with first world problems isn't necessarily going to resonate with, say, people in India who, the vast majority don't go to college. They can barely afford to go see the movie, a lot of them. So, and obviously China has a completely different system. Although they have a huge growing middle class, they have a completely different system of education and, and culture. So the upside of it, though, is coming of age can be a universal theme if done correctly. If it's not steeped in the culturalness of America, it can have a wider appeal. I think Clueless works kind of like that on some level because the main character's rich, and so I think other cultures can interpret that because it's not just she's not just an average American, she's a rich American, even amongst Americans. So that playing up her richness sort of justifies it to people in other countries who, whereas if you did some sort of like blue collar thing with high school students here, that would still sort of play as rich in other countries, some other countries anyway. So you definitely have those characters and they're coming of age, and it's about those changes, people are doing more adult things, and their lives are not going to be the same as they were. If you look at a movie like Superbad, that's a real strong contender about coming of age. It's about two friends who, are starting to drift apart and they have to deal with that. It's kind of a very funny movie, and then at the end, it's kind of a bit of a downer in a lot of ways in terms of the friendship. They're gonna try to remain friends, but you sense that they're not gonna be as tight as they once were. So, and there's a certain sadness in that, even though the movie's very funny. Um, the great thing about coming of age movies, especially the comedies, is you can do a lot of crazy things. You can have a lot of crazy characters, and the comedy gives you a little flexibility. Typically, the coming of age movies are based in reality. To go too far outside of that, sort of stretches the credulity of those serious moments. And I think there's always that serious moment in a coming of age movie where the characters do realize things are going to change. And to go too far afield of that. So, for instance, if you look at a movie like Wet Hot American Summer, isn't that what it's called? Wet Hot American Summer? The comedy movie with a million guys in it, and Paul Rudd and guys from the state and John Benjamin. That it's a parody of coming of age movies. They're not really taking the coming of age part very seriously. So it's really more of a comedy about those kinds of movies rather than that kind of movie. Back in the 80s, we had tons of them. We had like Meatballs. It's definitely one of them. That was a coming of age movie. Caddyshack was that kind of movie. In that era, coming of age movies were so popular. Caddyshack didn't really need the coming of age part in the movie. Like, that could have been rewritten to just add more comedy, but instead this was this thread of seriousness through the Caddyshack movie. But in some ways, that definitely helped the comedy because it made the golf tournament at the end. It gave it like some weight and gave it some high stakes. It wasn't just a wackiness. So, in some respects, I guess that coming of age plot can anchor your comedy in a place that people feel that it's worth kind of getting through the comedy, even if the comedy's sort of hit or miss. Animal House, of course, is a coming of age comedy in some respects. Pinto sort of has that thread. It's not super strong, obviously. It kind of gets overwhelmed by the other comedic elements, but it's in there. And even Boone has that moment, that serious moment with his girlfriend, where like him and Katie are looks like they're finished. So, romance will probably definitely be a part of it. There should be some kind of romance in there. Can't really help it with characters that young because you have to think back on your life and what you were like then, and that's pretty much one of the top things in the list. A little romance, having sex for the first time. That's usually a huge element of one of these stories. Someone who's a virgin having sex. I mean, that was definitely a huge theme in the 80s. I mean, that was like in every movie, how people were going to lose their virginity. Not so much anymore because now people, I don't know if they tend to lose their virginity earlier, but it's definitely a vibe like it's not as huge a deal as it was. I guess because in the 80s there was still this vibe like it wasn't just about person losing their virginity, but it was also about, the other elements of that in terms of your parents being upset by it, and maybe mildly some religious stuff in there. So now that society is a little more, I don't know if it's accepting of it, but it's definitely more like people get it. Like, oh yeah, there's those crazy teenagers. They're gonna try to have sex as much as possible. Like people kind of know. Um, Back in the '80s, it was still like, oh, don't you have sex, teenagers? Not totally, but definitely there was still some of that vibe going around, and definitely in parts of the country where it was where it's more religious, and there's still parts of the country that are a little bit religious, and that's still kind of an issue. Um, so your first act is going to be introducing the characters and the situation. You're going to introduce or lay the groundwork for the ages and the events that are going to precipitate the transition into adulthood. Whether that's everybody's going to the prom, everybody's graduating high school, people going to college. Um, those are the major ones. Turning 18, they're all pretty much similar, which is why it's so hard to do a new coming of age movie, because these have been done to death. And if you don't have a new twist on it, why make the damn movie? They could just, why should a studio buy your screenplay if they could just pull out one of their old hits from the 80s and remake it? I mean, if they pull out an old movie from the 80s, there are people who will see it just because, ooh, I remember that movie. Oh, they're going to recast people? Oh, wonderful. I'm going to go see it. So you have to come up with a totally unique way that somebody, comes of age. Clueless had the angle. I mean, it was high school, but it was also this whatchamacallit, this sort of legal thing, with lawyers. And that was more of an angle. I mean, high school was, but it was kind of like high school was sort of the background, you want to. So I guess my advice would be try to stay away from the high school part because it's been done to death unless you have a new take on the high school part. Another difficulty with making these movies is since the cast is going to be very young, it's very hard for Hollywood to cast people that are known because unless most actors age out of the high school dramas pretty quickly, and then you got to get new guys. So it tends to be a very tiny window for most actors. Yeah, actors in their 20s can still play high school students for a while, but Michael Cera, he's done. He's done doing high school, I think. He could do it for a long time. He was a skinny kid. He looked young, but he's got to be hitting late 20s at least. Got to be hitting 30 soon. So at that point, he's got to do something else. Jesse Eisenberg, same thing. For a while, he was playing kids, teenagers, young guys. Now he's getting older. He's got to move on to more grown-up roles. So second act is whatever the obstacle is. In Superbad, it was this party and getting with these girls. It's usually getting with the girls. In Clueless, it was about the protagonist sort of dealing with high school, but also dealing with her own maturity, but the high school part was kind of secondary in Clueless. I feel, I mean, it was there and it was funny, but it was like, it wasn't the main thrust. It was more the protagonist. In Meatballs, which was more of a classic '80s summer camp movie, the main thrust was and this was a big theme in the '80s, was the rivals. Revenge of the Nerds was kind of like that, although it wasn't much of a coming of age thing. It was a whole like rivals thing. It was always us versus them, the good guys versus the bad guys. So in the second act, you would get a lot more of that. Usually, what would happen, and in Caddyshack, is the good guys would try to do stuff, and the bad guys would knock them down, and they would go back and forth. And by the end of the second act, it was pretty bad for the good guys, and they needed to do something to get even or overcome the obstacle. And that was the setup for the third act, the big confrontation, or the big party in the case of Superbad. So, in the third act, the main thrust is going to be the rival, overcoming the rival, and then the other part of it is going to be how this has all changed your protagonist, and they're realizing adulthood is around the corner. Some of that comes out in the second act. Usually there's some resistance to it. It's like, no, 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 this is going to be the same forever. We're going to be friends forever. But by the third act, there's sort of a resignation or an acknowledgement of, things are changing. We are going to change, and we can deal with that. Which is a really positive message, I think, in a coming-of-age movie. That's kind of what you want. You want the sense that these characters have either won the day and or grown up, even if they haven't won. Sometimes they don't win, but in the classic sense, like in the 80s, the good guys would always win. Now it's like the win is, well, we're going to get through this. That's usually the win. We're going to survive this. We're going to be adults. We're going to be good people. And we're still going to be friends, although we may not be friends the same way we were. We're going to, grow and develop as people. So, again, it's really tough to do a coming-of-age movie and make it different. I've written a couple, but I wouldn't call them classic coming-of-age movies. They're more comedies with that sort of thrown in. So it's not a genre that by itself is desirable necessarily. You need some other elements in it now, I think. Although a classic high school movie is still pretty sellable to some degree, again, it's just really tough. And they're very topical too. So keep in mind that, to do one of them now and to write one now, you got to keep it up to date. And if you're a gray-haired old wizard like me, it is much tougher to sell that too, because typically Hollywood and producers, they want, if they want a young script, they usually want it from a younger writer. That's just the reality. I mean, Hollywood especially skews youthfully, and they love youth, and they love young newcomers. So if you're a young someone in their 20s and you got a coming of age movie, by all means, crank it out and start selling it. And don't let your youth be hidden when you pitch it around, because that in Hollywood is an asset to you. They want to have this cool story of how this young kid wrote a screenplay and now we're producing it and he came out of nowhere and he's the future of Hollywood. That's a great story. They love that. Don't hide your age if you're young in Hollywood. Never. Blare it out on trumpets. If you're 16 and you can write a coming of age screenplay, oh my God. There are people in Hollywood that would just fall over themselves to try to sell that movie and get some financing for it. In terms of finding the right cast, like I said, you have a very tiny window. You can attack, the various actors that would fit the roles. The way you would do that is you would go by IMDb Pro, which would give you access to the agencies of the actors on the International Movie Database. And then it's pretty easy to find their agents and send them a script. The agents are very public. That's what they're there for. You're not going to find the home address of a major Hollywood actor and be able to mail them anything. You're just first off, it's going to be tough to find their address, and secondly, if you mail them anything, it's going to go right to the trash. They have people, screening their mail, and it's not like they want to get their fan mail delivered directly to their house, because there's a lot of crazy people out there, and until they know you, you're not going to directly mail them or email them anything. So you want to get the agency of these young potential actors looking for screenplays, and that is just one avenue to pursue funding. If you could get one of these young actors on board, but again, keep in mind there's a tight window, so in 3 or 4 years, they kind of age out of it, and their whole career can change too. Even if they haven't aged out necessarily, if they get that adult role and their image changes, their sort of brand changes, then they're out. They don't want to play those high schoolers anymore. They don't want to play that young. It's typically, super bad. You look at Jonah Hill. He doesn't play those roles anymore. He can't. He's too old. He's changed his image, got in shape. He doesn't play those roles anymore. Michael Cera, also done. He hasn't really made the leap. He's still doing Arrested Development, but Jonah Hill is definitely out of that mode. So you got to really do some research if you're going to find celebrities to pinpoint and send them scripts. And that's a crapshoot too. I mean, it's a crapshoot if they're going to read it. It's a crapshoot if they're going to champion it for you. Selling to producers is the ideal way, because hopefully the producers have the money. They're probably not going to offer you money. They're probably going to offer you some sort of option deal, and then they're going to shop it around for potentially forever. I've been in development with things, and it literally takes years, and it sometimes you go through. I had a screenplay that was optioned for at least 2 years. I think it was a little longer. It was optioned officially for 2 years, but they continued with it for a while, trying to get funding. Probably like closer to 4 or 5. It just never happened. Good screenplay. That was a coming of age movie in a lot of respects. Totally needs a rewrite. If I did rewrite it, I would definitely put more coming of age stuff in it, because I think the stuff that's dated needs to come out. And there was a lot of crazy comedy I threw in there that made no sense to the screenplay. But so coming of age movies, it's not a bad thing to write if you're young. If you're not young, you probably want some other subgenre in there. So if you do a say, I don't know, Western movie and it's a coming of age movie, then you can always sell it as a Western, and then the coming of age part is sort of like your extra hook, your extra icing on the cake, or whatever genre you could think of. In some respects, Goodfellas was kind of a coming of age movie in its own weird way, because Henry Hill grows up and realizes that crime doesn't pay. So like that kind of plot is definitely, one you want to keep exploring, keep in your repertoire. You probably want at least one coming of age movie. I can think of another one that I did write. That's definitely a coming of age movie. Yeah, that one definitely is. Probably wouldn't work today, now that I think about it. But yeah, that one was a coming of age movie. I didn't market it that way, because I didn't know enough about screenplays and little subgenres like this. And I wrote it in the early 90s, so probably could have still come in on that coming of age wave of stuff because it was it's still different. It's still never been done. So as long as you have that hook, as long as you have that one unique hook, that one unique thing that makes it different from all the others. So, again, you should do your research. You should, if you're writing a coming of age movie, and you can do a coming of age movie that's a serious movie. It doesn't have to be a comedy, although a lot of them are, because it's kind of a fun time. But it can be very serious. It could be more of a drama. That totally works. Someone who's coming of age, and it's a very tough time. They've certainly done that in like war movies. War movies are definitely sort of coming of age movies, and they're very serious. So you could definitely do that. And again, those movies have other sellable points. They have other sellable points other than just the coming of age part. But that is it's always a net positive to have that in your description or in your screenplay, if it's possible. I mean, you don't want to hammer it in there just to have it, but people can relate to that. It's very relatable, because everybody's gone through that phase where they're young and they have to grow up and they have that moment, and that's a very important moment in movies. So all right, my name is Tony D. This is Joan of Arc, and that's screenwriting tips for this week. Check me out, still on Patreon. Also, my comics at the Webcomic Factory and Super Frat. Comment, say something, and I'll see you next time.